I'm not one to have favourites when it comes to knitting blankets. I enjoy knitting every blanket I make, but this one, who I've called Harvey, I have to say I found to be the most enjoyable blanket that I've knit this year. I think because it's a slightly longer pattern repeat, it's got some interesting texture built in between these garter stitch rows, and the longer pattern repeat means that you have to do less of them in the blanket. It just felt like this blanket flew off my needles, and I really hope that you will feel the same way too when you knit this. Harvey is a 20 row repeat. Don't let that put you off. I've kept it really nice and simple. There's lots of repetition, and you've also got 8 rows of garter stitch to break up the patterned rows that you're going to have to work. To knit a blanket the same size as mine, which is about 65 by 85 centimeters, you are going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. Some of you may also know that as 3-weight yarn or light worsted weight yarn. You are also going to need some 4mm knitting needles, circular knitting needles, not straight ones, because straight ones just won't be long enough for the width of this project. I like to use knitting needles that are anywhere between 80 centimeters to 100 centimeters in length, so anything above 80 centimeters is going to be absolutely fine. You're also going to need a tapestry needle for sewing in your ends, some scissors for obviously cutting your yarn, and then 2 stitch markers so that you can mark your side borders to make your knitting just that little bit easier. So without further ado, grab your needles, grab your yarn, and let's jump right into this pattern. For this blanket, you don't need to treat the garter stitch border and the middle panel as separate pattern repeats, which makes it really nice and easy to cast on. The pattern repeat for this blanket is 2 plus 1, which is really just a fancy way of saying that you need to cast on an odd number of stitches. For my blanket that you saw in the introduction, I cast on 131 stitches, so if you want a blanket wider than that, you are going to need to cast on more stitches, and as long as it's an odd number, you will be absolutely fine with your pattern multiple. I'm just going to cast on a very small sample today. I like to use the long tail cast on method, but if you have a cast on method that you prefer, then please feel free to use that one too. The first part of our blanket that we work after casting on is that bottom garter stitch border. So it means that we have got a nice section where every row is the same. So you are going to knit 15 rows exactly like this. Knit until you have 1 stitch left on your left hand needle. So knit until you only have 1 stitch left to work. I like to give the side edges of my blankets a really nice braided effect, and this is achieved by slipping the last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So instead of knitting it, you want to get your working yarn and pop it to the front of your work. Then you want to insert your right hand needle into the final stitch as if to purl, so you're going in from right to left, you're not going in from left to right, and then you just want to slip that stitch onto your right hand needle and off your left hand needle. Then once you've done that, you just lift that yarn over so that it comes to the front of your work and you don't inadvertently create an extra stitch. What you want to do now is go away and knit another 14 rows exactly like this one, so that you've worked a total of 15 rows. Once you've done that, we're going to be ready to start the main body of our blanket. After 15 rows, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. You should have 8 garter ridges facing you when you're about to start the row, and this is going to become the right side of our work. So the first row that we work is a right side row. When we work row 1 for the first time, we're going to do a little bit of setup work to place the markers, but every other time you work row 1 in this project, you're just going to slip the markers because they're already there. Row 1, you want to knit 9 stitches. You want to get the first of your stitch markers and pop it onto your right hand needle, and then carry on knitting until you have 9 stitches left on your left hand needle. Grab your second stitch marker and pop it onto your right hand needle when you hit that 9 stitches remaining, and then you want to knit the next 8 stitches. Then with that final stitch, just like we did for that bottom garter stitch border, you're going to pop the yarn in front of your work and slip that final stitch purlwise. Don't forget to lift your yarn to the front of the work so that you don't create an extra stitch by accident. Row 2, you want to knit until you hit the stitch marker, so knit 9 stitches. Slip your marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to purl across until you hit the next marker. When you hit it, slip that second marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to knit the next 8 stitches. And to finish off the row, you want to slip that last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 3, you want to knit 9 stitches, and that should take you to your stitch marker. Slip your stitch marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then knit 1. Then you want to work purl 1, knit 1, all the way until you hit the next stitch marker. So that's purl 1, knit 1, all the way along until that second stitch marker. You should hit your marker after a knit 1, and you want to slip the marker over from the left to the right needle and then knit 8 stitches. Slip the last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, and that completes that row. Row 4, knit 9 stitches, and that should take you to your stitch marker. Slip your marker over and then purl across until the second marker. Slip the second marker over as you hit it and then knit 8 stitches. And then finally slip that last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 5, you want to knit every single stitch until the final stitch. Slip your markers over as you come to them, and then the final stitch you want to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. So knit all the way across, slip those markers as you hit them, and then instead of knitting the last stitch, you are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 6, knit 9. Slip the marker over from the left to the right needle, and then you want to purl across until you hit your second marker. Slip the marker over and knit 8. And then slip that last stitch over, purlwise with the yarn in front, and that completes row 6. Row 7, knit the first 9 stitches. Slip the marker over and knit 1. Then you want to work across, working purl 1, knit 1, all the way until you hit the second marker. That's purl 1, knit 1, and repeat those 2 stitches until you hit the second marker, which should be after a knit 1. Slip that second marker over as you come to it and then knit 8. And then slip the last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 8, you want to start by knitting 9. Slip that stitch marker over and then purl across until the next marker. Slip the second marker over and knit 8. and then slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 9 is another nice and easy one. Just knit all the way across, slipping those stitch markers as you hit them, and then slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front instead of knitting it. Row 10, you want to knit 9. Slip the marker over and then purl across until you hit the second marker. Slip the second marker over and knit 8. Finish off by slipping that last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 11, knit 9. Slip the marker over and knit 1. Then work purl 1, knit 1 all the way across until you hit your second marker, which should be after a knit 1. Slip your second marker over and knit 8. Then slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 12, knit the first 9 stitches. That takes you to your first stitch marker. Slip the marker over and then purl across to your second marker. Slip that second marker over and then knit 8. And then slip that last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Rows 13 to 20 are exactly the same. I like to think of them as like a little treat for having worked the rows that involve a little bit of thinking, because for rows 13 to 20 all you have to do is knit every single stitch with the exception of the final stitch, and that stitch you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. Don't forget to just slip those stitch markers over as you come to them, but apart from that it's really nice and simple for the second half of this pattern repeat. So just to clarify, rows 13 to 20 inclusive are all knit rows. So if you go away and knit them, then I will show you what they look like after they're done, and also talk you through how we go building the rest of the blanket and then how we finish it off. After row 20 you should have a piece of knitting that looks a little bit like this. You should be just about to start a right side row, and you should have 4 garter ridges that make up rows 13 through to 20. What you would now go away and do is repeat rows 1 to 20 until your blanket is about 8 centimeters shorter than you want the final length to be. If you're knitting the same size blanket that I showed you in the introduction and you've cast on 131 stitches, I worked 12 sets of the 20 row repeat. So if you imagine this is that blanket, you would now go ahead and repeat rows 1 to 20 11 more times, so that you've worked a total of 12 sets of those 20 rows. What you then need to do before you go to start your border is you want to work rows 1 to 12 once more. So we leave out rows 13 to 20 for the final section before we start our border. So if you go ahead and do that, and then I will meet you at the point that you are ready to start your border. So just remember that for the final part before you start your border, you will do one more set of rows 1 to 12 and you will stop after row 12. So when your blanket is ready to start working the top garter stitch border, it will obviously be a lot bigger than mine. I've only worked one set of 20 rows, and then I've gone ahead and worked rows 1 to 12 once more, and I've just finished a row 12, so I'm just about to start a right side row. Your top garter stitch border is worked in pretty much the same way that you worked the bottom garter stitch border. We're going to just start knitting every stitch now. There are no more purl stitches, and we're going to remember to slip the final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. When you knit your first row, you can remove the stitch markers as you go, because we don't need to mark those points anymore. And you are going to knit a total of 16 rows of garter stitch to match your bottom garter stitch edge, so that just like you've got 8 garter ridges on your bottom border, you will have 8 garter ridges on the top border to match. So if you now go away and knit 16 rows of garter stitch, don't forget to slip the final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front instead of knitting it, and then come back and I will show you how we finish this blanket off and cast off to get it off our needles and into a finished piece of work. The very last part of our blanket that we need to work is the cast off. That's the bit that finishes it all off and gets it safely off our needles. I do have a video that shows you in depth how to work the knitted cast off that we are going to work in this video, but for the purposes of this tutorial I am going to show you very briefly. But if you're not familiar with the method, then I really would recommend you going and taking a look at the video linked above here now. The knitted cast off is really easy to work. You start by knitting 2 stitches. Don't knit them too tight, you want your tension to be fairly relaxed when you're working your cast off. Then you want to grab the first stitch you knitted with your left hand needle and lift it over the second stitch that you knitted and then off the needle. So you've gone from 2 stitches on your right hand needle to 1. Then you want to knit 1 more stitch and repeat that process again. Lift the right hand stitch over the left hand stitch and off that right hand needle, and you repeat that process all the way along the row. The golden rule is that if you ever have more than 2 stitches on this right hand needle, then you have worked too many stitches and you just need to take a step back because you've gone wrong. So if you work this process all the way along, knit 1, lift 1, and I'll meet you at the end of the row and show you how we finish things off. At the very end of your cast off row, you'll be left with 1 stitch here on your right hand needle and no stitches left on your left hand needle. What you want to do now is pull upwards to make this last stitch big so that there's no risk of it undoing. Then you can get rid of your needles, we don't need those anymore, and you can break your yarn. Leave a tail that's about 25 centimeters long so that you've got enough to sew in. And then to make it extra secure, I like to grab the tail and thread it through this larger stitch and then very gently pull to tighten everything up. Give it a nice tug to tighten it up, and then you would go ahead and sew in your end and that would not even be visible. All that's left to do now is to sew in your ends and you have a finished blanket. And there you go, that's how you knit yourself your very own Harvey blanket. Just a couple of things before I go. Harvey is not a reversible pattern. I often get asked on my blankets to see the rear of the blanket. So you can see that he does have a very definite right and wrong side, but the wrong side is not ugly, it's just a lot plainer than the right side. If you like to have written instructions to follow along with the video, I have left those on my blog and I've popped the link in the description below, so please feel free to go and take a look at that too. And if you'd like to have more blanket inspiration, then I've linked a video up here that I think you'll like as well. That's all from me for today, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!